Hello again. So today we're going to read chapter 11 and 12 of George's Marvellous Medicine by Roald Dahl. Chapter 11 is called Mr. Cranky's Great Idea. The next day George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvellous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant saucepan had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then we can sell it to every farmer in the world so that all of them can have giant animals. We'll build a marvellous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at £5 a time. We'll become rich and you'll become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk in his toast. "Don't you understand that this tremendous invention of yours is going to do what it's going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Why won't they?" asked George. "Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It'll change the world." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said again. "Don't keep saying wait a minute," shouted Mr. Cranky. "There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once." "Do calm down, my dear," Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, "and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "To heck with my cornflakes," cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. "Come on, George, let's get going. The first thing we'll do is make one more saucepanful as a tester." "But, Dad," said little George, "the trouble is—" "There won't be any trouble, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put the same stuff in the saucepan as you did yesterday, and while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item, and that's how we'll get the magic recipe." "But, Dad," George said, "please listen to me." "Why don't you listen to him?" Mrs. Cranky said. "The boy's trying to tell you something." But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. "And then," he cried, "when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on an old hen just to be absolutely sure we've got it right. And after that, we'll shout hooray and build a giant factory." "But, Dad—" "Come on then, what is it you want to say?" "I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put in the saucepan to make the medicine," George said. "Of course you can, my dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end, you see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in?" I went up to the bathroom first," George said. "I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table." "Come on then," cried Mr. Cranky. "Up we go to the bathroom." When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosols and empty bottles. "That's great," said Mr. Cranky. "That tells us exactly what you used. If anything is empty, that means you used it." So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. "A box of powder," said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. "Helga's hairspray, flowers of turnips perfume. Terrific! This is going to be easy. Where did you go next?" To the laundry room," George said. "But are you sure you haven't missed anything up here, Dad?" "That's up to you, my boy," Mr. Cranky said. "Have I?" "I don't think so," George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. "My goodness me, what a mass of stuff you used!" he cried. "No wonder it did magic things. Is that the lot?" "No, Dad, it's not," George said, and he led his father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept and showed him the 5 big empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. "Anything else?" Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put anything else in. Mr. Cranky leapt into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything that was on the list. Then he went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines that George had used. Now show me how you did it, George, he said. Come along, show exactly how you mixed them all together. This next chapter is called Marvellous Medicine number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big saucepan was on the stove. All the things that Mr. Cranky had brought were lined up on the sink. Come along, my boy, cried Mr. Cranky. Which one did you put in first? This one, George said. Golden Gloss hair shampoo. And he emptied the bottle into the pan. Now the toothpaste, George said, and then the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail varnish. Keep at it, my boy, cried Mr. Cranky, dancing round the kitchen. Keep putting them in. Don't stop, don't pause, don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work. One by one, George poured and squeezed all the things into the saucepan. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. And when it was all done, the saucepan didn't seem to be quite as full as it had been the first time. Now what did you do? Said Mr. Cranky. Did you stir it? I boiled it, George said, but not for long, and I stirred it as well. So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the saucepan and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon that he'd used before. It doesn't look brown enough, George said. Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten. What? Cried Mr. Cranky. Tell me quick, because if we've forgotten even one tiny thing, it won't work, not at least in the same way. It was a quarter of brown gloss paint, George said. That's what I've forgotten. Mr. Cranky shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village, bought the paint, and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the saucepan. Aha, that's better, George said. That's more like the right colour. It's boiling now, cried Mr. Cranky. It's boiling and bubbling, George. Is it ready yet? It's ready, George said. At least I hope it is. Right, shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. Let's test it. Let's give some to the chicken. My heavens alive! Why don't you calm down a bit, Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. Calm down, cried Mr. Cranky. You expect me to calm down when we're here mixing up the greatest medicine that's ever discovered in the history of the whole world? Come along, George. Dip a cupful out of the saucepan and get a spoon, and we'll give some to the chicken, just to make absolutely certain we've got the correct mixture. Outside in the yard there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's Marvellous Medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt, just the way the silly chickens do. George crouched down, holding out a spoonful of Marvellous Medicine number 2. Come on, chicken, he said. Good chicken, chick, chick, chick. A white chicken with black specks on its feathers looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went peck. The effect that medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect that medicine number 1 had had. Whoosh! Shrieked the chicken as it shot 6 feet up into the air and came down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer. What's happening to it? Cried Mr. Cranky. Something's wrong, George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up in the air the chicken body went. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd, with its long, long legs and its ordinary little body perched high up on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. Oh, my sainted aunts, cried Mr. Cranky. We've got it wrong. This chicken's no good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken legs. I must have left something out, George said. I know you've left something out, said Mr. Cranky. Now think, what is it? There's the chicken with his long legs. I've got it, said George. What was it? Quick! Flea powder for dogs, George said. You mean you put flea powder in the first one? Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it. Then that must be the answer. Wait a minute, said George. Did you have brown shoe polish on our list? No, we didn't, said Mr. Cranky. I remember I used that too, said George. Well, no wonder it went wrong, said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy some more flea powder and some more shoe polish. And we'll find out next time if they manage to get the mixture right. See you again soon.